Order, order. Thank you for joining us today for our final evidence session of the Youth Select Committee's inquiry into youth violence and social media. This session is to look at education on youth violence and online risks. Can I please start by asking the panel to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your organisation, starting with Patrick, please.
My name is Patrick Green. I'm CEO of the Ben Kinsella Trust. If I may take a little time on this, just to give you a bit of background of who Ben was. Ben was a 16-year-old teenager who was murdered in 2008. Ben was murdered in an unprovoked attack, simply walking home with friends from a night out. But 3 months earlier, in April 2008, in a piece of creative writing, Ben had written to the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, to challenge the government for what he felt was their inaction to keep young people safe. And Ben was an activist, a campaigner against violence against young people. I feel very proud to be here, and I know Ben would have been very proud to be here to see young people of his age still fighting to ensure that this topic is heard at the highest level. So it's a great privilege to be here. Thank you.
Will?
Great. So I'm Will Gardner. I'm the CEO of ChildNet International. ChildNet, by way of background, we focus on online safety. We're a charity that's been around since 1995, and our mission is to help make the internet a great and safe place for children. And we work in the space of education, in policy, and in youth voice. And youth voice underpins our education and our policy work, as we want to give young people the information and skills they need so they can use the internet safely and look after themselves and look after others whenever and wherever they're accessing technology, but also working to support those that support young people, so parents and carers and educators as well.
Thank you. My initial question is going to you, Patrick, but Will, please feel free to jump in after. What actions effectively prevent vulnerable young people from engaging in serious youth violence?
I suspect after all the evidence you've heard over the last couple of days, you've got a lot of feedback on this. If I may start by not answering your question and then move to answering your question. I think there's, for us, in the work that we do at the Ben Kinsella Trust, the action is to support all young people from being engaged in serious youth violence is of our principal concern. We've been working directly with young people for the last 11 years, and we've seen significant changes in terms of engagement with young people and their experiences around knife crime. It's an ever-changing, ever-evolving space. We published a report last May called Keeping Young People Safe, which took the feedback from 9,500 young people. And it principally told us what I think you've probably heard in other evidence. 64% of those young people in London were anxious or concerned about knife crime. And you would have heard from Kieran this morning from the Youth Endowment Fund, who I'm sure has talked about the research that they've just published, showing that 20% of young people have been victims of violence, and of other 60% of young people were concerned about knife crime. Those figures are hugely disproportionate to the level of knife crime that we see. The levels of fear are enormously high. And those high levels of fear are real. They are tangible, and young people are trying to make decisions to keep themselves safe. 1 in 4 of young people who we speak to before we intervene with think in certain circumstances you carry a knife to protect yourself. And it's understandable if you have that level of fear, how you would consider to make those and that belief system to form. And if you consider the majority of the young people we're speaking to and we work with are 10, 11 and 12. So we're a prevention charity working right at the sort of upstream. For those young people to hold those belief systems so early tells you an awful lot about what's happening. And one thing we don't do very well is talk to young people about staying safe. And what we've seen over the years evolve is young people know about the terrors of knife crime. We don't need to educate young people about how horrible knife crime is. They know how horrible knife crime is. We don't need to educate young people about how gruesome zombie knives are, etc. If I show a young person a picture of a zombie knife, they will quickly go to the phone and show me a bigger knife, a more gruesome knife. All of that is out there. What we need to talk to young people about is those strategies that they can employ to keep themselves safe. And we need to dissipate some of the fear that exists for young people in our society. And I believe that has been missed in terms of interventions for far too long. We're not listening to young people. We're not acknowledging that their fear is real. So that's one of the principal actions I think that needs to be taken in terms of when we call education. It is about helping young people to understand how they can resolve their levels of fear. If those levels of fear were happening in a society which is franchised and has voting rights, I think government will be taking a much stronger view on this and be much more concerned that this proportion of the population are feeling as they do. To directly answer your question, Chair, about the effectively vulnerable young people, well, fear makes young people vulnerable as well. And fear actually, when you're fearful, you're less trusting. And so it's really important that we address this issue full on. I will repeat, I think, what you'll have heard from many others about some of the underlying issues about recognising special education needs in young people much earlier, exclusions from school and the damage that they do, adverse childhood experiences, exposure to violence, deprivation, poverty, racism. There's a long list which I'm sure you've dealt with. They all play a fact in this. Fear is also binding a lot of that together and making this problem a much bigger problem, and that's what we see. And I think that's what, in terms of a response, we need to acknowledge the fear is real and work directly with young people to help dissipate those levels of fear and keep them safe, give them real strategies to stay safe.
Will, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I guess I should say straight away that our area of work is quite broad, and it's not particularly focused in the offline elements of violence in relation to the question that you asked. But there are parallels with other things that we see online, where I would probably come up with a very similar response to that which Patrick made. So I wholeheartedly endorse what he had said. And if we're talking about broader online risks, where I think we have more traction in our organisation, such as issues like online sexual harassment and bullying and hate, which I know are kind of outside the remit of this particular study, then education is an absolute prime objective within this space for children. And we need to think about younger children, not just teenagers, in relation to issues that we're talking about, but also those that support them. And I'm sure we'll get onto that, but the regulatory environment within which this type of this content, if we're talking about it from an online perspective, exists. But I don't want to preempt any future questions.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Sienna.
My question's for Patrick. How important do you think the role of schools is in preventing youth violence, and do you think this role can be improved?
It's hugely important. When we first set up the trust initially, we consulted with a lot of young people about how they wanted to engage on the subject of knife crime and knife crime prevention, and they told us they wanted this to be part of the school curriculum. They absolutely wanted that, and I believe the APPG in 2019 said exactly the same. So if you speak to young people, they will tell you having knife crime prevention as part of the school curriculum is hugely, hugely important. So schools are a perfect place for the delivery. They play a huge part in a number of aspects of young people's lives, not just around safety. So engaging schools, I think that there are challenges within the existing school system about bringing schools on board. We've been doing it for some time, and what we find is when schools engage, they immediately see the benefits of that. Many are reluctant to acknowledge for fear that knife crime will create a stigma for the school. But if you're talking about how to understand the dynamic of serious violence, knife crime and the exploitation of young people that they're drawn into criminality. The way you deal with that is by helping young people particularly understand pathways, but also the positive aspects of making positive decisions, and which reflect on other areas of life. So what we find is with schools, once they engage, they see the positive response of young people, not just in terms of responding to violence, but going to a number of other things as well, because both go hand in hand. So schools play a considerable part in tackling this issue. Yes, it's answered my question.
Will, would you like to add anything?
I would just wholeheartedly say what Patrick has said. Again, with the caveat that my experience is slightly different to the actual area of this question. But schools have an absolute key role to play in education around child safety more broadly, and the work we do is focused on is online. But the work is there for us to do to support schools to do that job. It's not always easy, and we need to make sure that we are providing schools with the materials, making sure that there is space within their busy timetables that they can do this, making sure that teachers are feeling confident and trained to deliver on topics which they might feel uncomfortable about, and then keeping a track of what works in this space and make sure that we're sharing that good practice amongst schools. I think it's easy to say schools fix this, but I think it's better to say school have a role to play, and let's support them in that role.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll just follow on. A really good point that Will made, if I could underline it, is the confidence of schools, particularly teachers, to deliver on this content. We found that once we've engaged with schools, 3/4 of the teachers then feel more confident to carry on with those lessons beyond that engagement. So it's a scary topic for everybody, particularly teachers who may be facing young people teaching, but who possibly know more about this subject matter than they do. So there's a skills level and confidence building that's really important and part of this, to give schools confidence in this. I think Will made a very good point, which I think deserves to be underlined.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Manal in.
Thank you. So my question is open to both of you, but I'll start with Patrick. So this mentioning of fear and how it makes young people vulnerable is really important, but a lot of young people may not be comfortable to seek help at school because of this fear, like being referred to as a snitch, for example. So how else do you think we can make support for young people accessible?
The more people you have around you who you trust, the more opportunity you have to be able to convey how you feel, not just about fear of knife crime, but many other things. The more we open young people up to new experiences, whether that's through youth centres, whether that's through other activities outside school, because you may thrive away from school rather than in school, and be more confident in those environments and feel more trusting in those environments. We also need to educate adults, parents, teachers, and those trusted adults in how to conduct those conversations. If you're fearful, the last thing you want is somebody who's going to heighten your fear. You need to, and often adults, in terms of their bespoke response to knife crime, is to tell you how horrible it is and to ramp up the levels of fear. What you need is somebody who can understand where you are, listen, recognise what you're feeling is real, and then allow you to work through that. And sometimes that's about two people being in a really scary place for a few moments and not rushing to have all the answers. So yeah, there's a little bit about education, but there's also a lot about giving young people more opportunities. And what we've seen more recently was when you close youth clubs, when you take away those positive activities that young people have, you're reducing those opportunities. So while it's often very difficult to say that going to a youth club, playing sport, being involved in the arts directly relates, it's giving you contact with positive mentors, positive people, and that's hugely, hugely important in terms of addressing the question you've just raised.
Thank you. Will, would you like to add anything?
I would, and Perhaps I can answer it again and kind of by talking about something slightly different. It was a topic area, but which I think might have learnings for this particular area. So we did some work with teenagers around online sexual harassment amongst teenagers, and we asked them what the barriers were for them to go and talk to someone within the school environment. And there were a number of different things. One was they thought they would get into trouble. They didn't know what would happen next after they made the report. So sometimes they said they didn't know who they should talk to within the school community. Even they were talking about that teachers are just too busy to talk to. There were a number of different reasons where you kind of hear all of that, and I think it's really important to hear what those barriers are to a young person coming forward to talk about anything, and then to see, well, what can you do to address those particular fears? And I think each of those things that I've just described are things which school communities can look to overcome to facilitate young people to feel confident and comfortable to come forward. And again, my last analogy is that we at ChildNet, we organise Safer Internet Day in the UK, a big national online safety campaign. And after the day, we survey schools, what difference did the day make? And we had 51% of the schools said that it led to young people coming forward and talking about things online that they were worried about. And I think the logic is absolutely clear. If the schools can say, we can talk about this subject, it will encourage young people to feel confident to come forward and talk about that. And I would kind of offer that learning up in terms of an online safety perspective and offer it across to the same scenario that you're talking about here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, how could we incentivize schools to deliver lessons, and in particular schools who are maybe reluctant to talk to their young people about this complex issue? I will direct that to Patrick first.
That's a really good question. And one that I don't know the answer to. I can tell you from our experience of setting up an anti-narcotic charity and building relationships with schools. There's no two schools that are particularly the same. The approach has to be, the incentive has to be that they know that the intervention works, and you'll have heard about the Youth Endowment Fund, they have to trust that what you do is in the best interests of the young person, not in the best interests of the charity. So those are key points in terms of engagement with schools. Secondly, as an incentive, that the interventions fit in with the curriculum. Schools are performance driven, and they are compelled to deliver against the curriculum. So being able to show schools that what you're doing contributes to the curriculum is really, really important as well. They're the kind of softer pieces. I think, part of it is, and I think that possibly the bit that's missing is in terms of the Department of Education and the government pushing schools to actually move into this space. Because if you're resistant, there's little pressure from Ofsted, for example, to challenge you around this. And, that would be probably the biggest incentive that all schools follow, is this appearing as a positive in your Ofsted report, that you were engaged in positive.
And Will, do you have anything to add?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's schools do have incentives. Obviously, they have incentives. They have statutory duties to keep their pupils safe at school, and it's in their best interest that their young people are safe and following the rules that the whole school community are following. And as then thinking about, well, what are the levers you can do additional levers you can use with that? And I think Patrick's already mentioned the curriculum can be a good way of prizing open time for schools to do that, kind of really making it that there's no choice, but you have to cover that. Clearly, there are other competing priorities that a school will have to manage, and they'll probably take that decision, well, they will take that decision at a local level unless there's an overarching curricular demand. And there might be some other ways in which you can look at it in terms of teacher training, teacher professional development. There are kind of look at the different options there are to try and encourage schools in different directions. So there's a kind of a mixture of carrot and sticks, I think, in the box that we can pull out to really help incentivize schools in this direction.
Thank you. I would like to bring Sienna in.
My question is for Will. So, how do harmful online interactions between young people how does that spill out or translate into violence in the real world?
Well, I mean that's again, if I can talk about that a bit tangentially in terms of, I think it has an impact on the viewer. I mean, we talk a lot about content in the work that I do and inappropriate content, and included in that is about violent content. And I think in terms of that spilling out into replicated activities, I hear that there's research which talks about that from other online risks which are potentially harmful for children and young people. So, for example, topics like pornography, where there is data that does have an impact on young people's views of what sex is or what relationships are and what's normal within this space. So, I think for violent content, you would see there's a very similar likely outcome where it helps to normalize behaviors, desensitizes people to what they are seeing, and almost demonstrates, well, other people are doing it, so it's almost like justifying it in some sense of a way. So I think those are the types of issues which will come to mind to my mind. But I've saw the Youth Endowment Fund report, which I think you heard about this morning, which talks about how the impact of what young people see online can have on their offline um, lives in terms of becoming more withdrawn and heightening fear and other things. And that was also married up with research done by Ofcom earlier this year, particularly in relation to violent content. They did some qualitative research with professionals working with children, and some of them said exactly the same thing. So I think there is an interplay between content, including violent content, into offline manifestations.
Thank you. I will now hand over to Macy.
Just to follow on from the question and the topic around education, I wanted to direct this to you, Will. So in your assessment, what does effective support and education to help young people navigate online harms look like? And how would you measure that success in this area?
That's a good question. So, well, I think what we need to bake in, very similar to what Patrick said before, in terms of what's successful in this space, is to include young people's voice in this activity. We did an interesting survey in 2023 asking young people about the education they'd received around online safety, and the majority said that they found the assemblies or lessons they had in school, that they found that they were useful. But 30% of young people, and these were 8 to 17-year-olds, said that they didn't address the issues that they were most worried about online. And I think that in order to make sure that education support is going to be better targeted at children and young people, then we need to understand, well, what is it that are of primary concern? What are the issues which young people are coming across most frequently or causing potentially the most harm? And those are conversations we need to make sure we're having in order to make sure we're hitting the spot in the best way. But on the other side, we run a program where we train up young people to be educators in school communities. And I'm a great believer in the power of youth voice in terms of reaching peers, but also for reaching staff and reaching parents, who can be a very difficult audience to reach in terms of educational messages. And clearly they've got a key role to play here. So I think bringing in youth voice will enable an authentic voice of lived experience, because young people's experience of technology is different. We have, there's a great quote from a 14-year-old at one of our events said, every generation's experience of youth is different, and ours is framed by social media. And he absolutely brilliantly described why my adult's experience of social media is not the same. It's a fast-moving environment, and so we need to make sure that we're tapping into young people to keep pace with the issues that we really need to be dealing with. So I think I'd put that kind of as a marker down. But then I think there's broader activities in terms of the education, in terms of how it's delivered, across the school community involving parents and carers, because obviously young people are accessing technology a lot outside of school, and trying to kind of bring a shared educational response and support network across the community. I'll probably stop talking now because I can go on for forever, but if you have follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yes, using your assessment, is the government effectively engaging with young people? And if not, how could they do that?
When you say engaging with young people, what do you mean?
As in taking on board their views, their experiences, what they have
Right.
to say to the government.
Yeah, so I think there's been a degree of that happening. Clearly, there's academic research that can help capture young people's voice and opinion through percentages and data. That can be quite slow to turn out results in this space. But there are other kind of surveys and research happening in that space. But there are, and another plus is that we are seeing more and more organisations develop youth advisory boards. Like we have one at ChildNet, and I know the NSPCC have one. I've even seen some tech companies develop youth advisory boards too. I think TikTok produced one. I've got one going relatively recently, and so there are opportunities around. And I know when Ofcom do their consultations for the Online Safety Act and the development of the codes, which are going to be binding on industry, they are running focus groups in different parts of the country. So there is some work done in that, but I don't think it's really properly holistically done. We've got stats that say 80% of young people believe that their voice should be heard in relation to the future of technology. 80% of 8 to 17-year-olds believe they're not being heard enough in relation to this particular issue. And I think that's something that we need to find better ways to respond to.
Thank you. Please can I hand over to Monya?
Thank you. So just following up on that, this is directed to Will. So who do you think carries the responsibility to educate young people on the type of content which is illegal and harmful to them under the Online Safety Act?
Well, ultimately, it's going to sound like a real cop-out of an answer, but everybody has a responsibility in this space, and certainly we all need to be doing more. Clearly, government have a role in trying to help support the education sector to be able to talk about this, but industry have got an important role to play here too, and we are seeing some movements in that direction. We're seeing, I don't know, safety centers being set up on the major platforms. There's increasing use of nudges within, like, reminders in relation to like moment in time advice that can be given to young people whilst they're using technology. And there's more, absolutely more that could be done. And then there's parents and carers, and we need to absolutely support them because they are the closest form of support to children and young people. And we need to make sure that they feel they're confident to be able to take their parenting into the online environment as well as offline. So there is a kind of a multi-level layered way to go here. And it's challenging because we're talking about something which isn't static. It's continually changing, and it requires some flexibility and nimbleness in the way we try to respond. But I think that would be my answer.
I would like to hand over to Sophie.
Thank you. I'll direct this question to Will, but Patrick, please feel free to come in if you've got anything to add. How do we ensure home-educated young people receive the same youth violence and online safety education and interventions as those attending school full-time?
That's another very good question, and it's a difficult one to immediately think of the answers to. I mean, we need to make sure that we are using what avenues we can to make sure that we are supporting all educators, whether they be at home or in school, in order to try and make sure that this is part of that educational experience of children and young people. And there has been some work done in that, but I think it's quite hard to do something which is uniformly and holistically able to cover all the people that we need to. you might think there's some easy ways where you can, as new teachers come into the workspace, well, why don't we make sure that they all have online safety education in their training? So when they get to the school environment, that's part and parcel of how they understand being an educator. Wouldn't that be an important way forward? And certainly there have been efforts trying to make that happen. For homeschooling, clearly that is less of a possibility. And I personally am not too familiar with what tools you have at your disposal to support, ensure that educators working in that way are able to cover that topic.
If I add, I think it's a great question and highlights a real concern that many people have about the number of young people in the home schooling sector, which I believe is growing. The fact that I can't answer that tells you an awful lot about that sector, and I think recent events this week I think have highlighted I think concerns that some people would have about protection of young people in that environment. But the answer is I don't think there is an answer to that question yet, and that's the answer that I think really needs to be highlighted.
I believe Samir has.
Yeah, to both really, but we'll start with Will. So Australia's government has introduced legislation to ban under 16s from social media. What's your view on whether the UK should adopt a similar policy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm hearing that discussion happening a lot at the moment. I think my view is that it does let tech companies off the hook a little bit, in that they don't need to therefore provide services which are safe for children who are under the age of 16. And given that we know how many young people are under the age of 13 on these services at the moment, that would be quite risky to put that. I think I prefer to look at how we can make the services safer and cater for those ages. I think there's a second point, is that we are not that confident about what the age verification or assurance systems are going to do. I mean, we've got Ofcom introducing the codes probably over the course of next year. And I think we need to be confident that if we're going to introduce a ban, that it has some meaning behind it. And I think my third worry about it is that I worry about whether it would bring the outcome that is intended by the action. And I'm not confident that a ban in such a way will lead to necessarily better outcomes for children and young people. And I think the voice of children aged 13 to 16 has been quite absent in this whole policy debate. And I think that's an important voice that we need to hear, because if the ban, let's imagine it's effective and young people are cut off from age of under 16s from social media activities, what is the cost of that? What are the benefits that those young people lose as a result of that ban? And does the cost of those benefits, is that less than negative? So as you can see, I'm not convinced that is the way forward. And I do sense that sometimes the language of bans gets quite politicized as being a simple solution to an issue which really isn't simple. It is more complex, and I think we need to be much more reflective in terms of reaching the outcomes that we want to achieve.
I agree with everything that Will said. I think it does let social media companies off the hook. It's their product, that they should make it safe. As someone who campaigns a lot for legislation, particularly around knife sales, I'm also aware that there is displacement, and it can often drive supply underground. What we don't want is a dark web for social media, and legislation is an imperfect way of dealing with social problems. The people who can sort this out are the tech companies. And they're the ones who tend to avoid scrutiny and have not stepped up. They're absolutely incapable of self-regulation, and it's been proved. Legislation is imperfect. So I would push this back at social media companies. Make your product safe. that's the solution.
Just to follow up, how effective do you think smartphone or social media bans are for under 16 in certain circumstances, so for schools or otherwise like that, in improving online safety?
Early days, but the feedback I've got has been very positive about the non-use of smartphones in schools in terms of engagement, education, improvement, etc. So, early studies would indicate it seems positive in terms of in the school environment. Will?
I haven't got much more to add to what Patrick has said. I mean, I don't think I have anything to hand which I can show. Look, this makes things better. I can understand. I mean, a ban is a very big word, but it might be interpreted differently in different school environments. What does a ban actually mean? Does it mean that you can't bring the device into school, or it means you can't bring it out of your bag, or does it mean you can't bring it out of your bag in lessons? That there's different ways that schools, and they have the flexibility to approach this in a number of different ways. And I think I would like to see what the data says. Obviously we want to find outcomes which are beneficial for children and young people in relation to this. So I'm prepared to be open-minded and wait to see what that data tells us.
Thank you. I would like to hand over to Sienna.
My question is for Patrick. So earlier you talked a lot about fear and like the fear of young people, and you said that it's a scary topic to deal with for even adults. So how can we enforce preventative measures and spread awareness about the issues of youth violence without amplifying this fear, particularly when you think about children that are going through trauma from previous incidents?
Yeah, you talk positively about young people. You acknowledge fear. You show. You don't show negative images. You show positive images. You show how aspiration can lead to goals. You frame this in a very positive way of engagement, as well as acknowledging where young people are, and at the moment that they're very fearful. That's a very vague answer, I'm aware. But in the work that we do, it is about helping you understand the options you have available, which at the time that you're fearful, you may not fully grasp all the options that you have available. So it's framing this in the role of a positive intervention is really, really important. I've said this before, so I'm repeating. What you don't do is then, if you're worried about knife crime, I confirm all your worries by telling you how terrible it is and show you even more graphic and just make things worse, which for many people is the sort of default. Sort of the capacity is if we're running campaigns, if you're talking to young people, particularly about knife crime, the best way to get engagement and the best way to alleviate that fear is to talk positively about positive outcomes about it, your engagement.
I would like to hand over to Sophie.
Thank you. I'd just like to return to the idea of fear within the youth population and the support available. In earlier sessions, we've heard about the lack of emotional support for the victims and perpetrators of youth violence. How important do you think access to therapy and to creative outlets is in combating youth violence? If we could start with Patrick.
Yeah, massive. It's a really effective form of engagement, an effective form of expression, not a safe way to release emotions, and a safe way of dealing with emotions that you may find very, very difficult to explain or very, very difficult to hold. It's for many young people, it's something that they don't get the opportunity to experience, and therefore it's only rage and anger that come out and not what sits beneath that. The ability to access therapy and the thresholds to get to therapy for young people are far too high. We talk about prevention and early intervention. We should be engaging with young people on this emotional level much, much earlier. When we set up the Kinsella Trust and we started to look at where we might be best placed as a new charity to add real value to this, Ben's sister Brooke who had been an actress and worked in EastEnders, took 3 years out of her acting career to do what you're doing. Talk to people who are working in this field and try and find out what works, and if it works, what could she do to with a celebrity status to get the government to recognise this and to invest in these services. But when Brooke published a report for the Home Office called Tackling Knife Crime Together in 2011, and when we as a charity sort of sat through Brooke's findings, an observation that came to us was, for young people who do something wrong or behaviour brings them to attention of somebody else, we rush to them, and there are lots of really, really good services who get the young people and try and get them back to where they need to be into a safe place. And you'll have heard, I think, evidence from many of those organisations over the last 2 days. What struck us was, unless you did something wrong, nobody notices you. You're invisible. And then when you do something wrong, everyone goes, oh my goodness, I didn't know. How did this happen? Our ability to identify young people with some vulnerabilities long before the behaviour displays those vulnerabilities was really, really low. The bank establishment was set up, and that's what we do. We work with young people nobody's worried about because they're on education, and we use an immersive experience. And through that, we identify lots of young people who have some dysfunctional thinking or behaviours long before they've ever been in trouble with school. They're not excluded from school, and we're able to work with the schools to get those young people the support they need much, much earlier. In terms of the thresholds and the questions that you asked me about, providing therapy and those emotional support to young people, if we do this much earlier and do this before young people have done something wrong or got into trouble, we do an awful lot to alleviate this. But we don't seem to understand the value of prevention when it comes to the criminal justice system. We get it when it comes to medicine, and also we will all visit GPs. We'll all be screened for diseases that we don't have, and nobody thinks it's a waste of money. We don't do that around violence, and that is the shift change that we've got to do.
Thank you. I would like to hand over to Manal.
Okay. I'd like to direct my question to Will, and then Patrick, I'll bring you in after. So how effective is current government policy in educating and protecting young people from online risks and being drawn into serious violence? And are there any changes you'd like to see made?
So there are some things happening. There is guidance for schools called Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is statutory guidance for all schools, and all staff in schools need to be aware of it. That does include online safety in that. So it's there. Promoting online safeguarding is a duty on schools to do. So that's a tick. There are some other ticks in relation to the curriculum, with the computing curriculum, with the RSHE curriculum, where online safety is in there. So I think we see some movements happening there. And then obviously the big thing, which we haven't spoken about yet so much, is the Online Safety Act, which got passed in 2023. It's not so much about education, but it's about how do you regulate online service providers and make them more transparent and accountable. And that's something that Ofcom is busy looking to do. But there will need to be, I think, an education piece that helps people understand what that is. Like, what does that mean for you in your everyday interactions? What should be your expectations of providers? So there's definitely more that can be done around that. But I think there is always more that governments to do. We're doing some work around a particular piece of work around scams at the moment, and young people are absolutely saying they want more support. They want government to do more. They want industry to do more in relation to how to protect them. So I think the list of things for government to do will be never ending in this space. And once the Online Safety Act is properly in place, we have generative AI, which is there causing or providing incredible opportunities. And absolutely, we need to make sure that schools are able to harness that and use that for their positive benefit and encourage young people to engage with incredible technology as it comes into play. But then how do you make sure that harmful content is how are we managing that in terms of safeguarding young people in the use or the outputs of such tech. So some work is being done, but more, and some is happening. But absolutely, there will always be more that needs to be done from a government perspective.
Yeah, I have some sympathy for government in this arena, in that the tech companies are not doing anything near enough. We should never have had to go to an online harms bill. They should have been able to regulate, and the government are mopping up what the social media companies should be doing and the tech companies should be doing. So I have some sympathy, because it's almost an impossible job for government to do, and they're probably not best placed to deliver on some of this either. I think we should be holding tech companies to account far more for what's happening, and they should be policing their platforms with much more rigour.
Thank you.
I would like to ask this question to both of you. What do you think the government should consider in its review of the national curriculum in relation to our inquiry? And I can start with Patrick, please.
Yeah, the homeschooling question is a really good one. I think that's front and centre about where a number of young people may be missing out in terms of education, and particularly around safety. There is definitely a gap with engaging schools on the topic of safety, and particularly violence and knife crime prevention. And I think in terms of flagging, particularly schools where knife crime, violence issues are prominent or in the environment, and that takes part in and that covers probably most of UK, not just the big cities. But yes, to compel schools to do far more, I think will be my recommendation.
Will?
I'm not sure if I've got much more to add to what Patrick has said, to be honest.
Thank you. I would like to hand over to Zafira now.
Thank you. Well, my question is to you, and I would, of course, open it up to Patrick afterwards. In your assessment, are you confident that measures due to be implemented under the Online Safety Act will adequately protect young people from exposure to illegal and harmful content online?
Well, I mean, that's a big wait and see moment, isn't it? So the Ofcom is in place, and it's doing a lot of work in trying to get itself in position to be to regulate. And they are busy writing the binding code, the codes that we're binding on these online providers to make sure that they are better protecting children and young people. And violent content, there's two types of content. There's primary priority content and priority content. And violence is in the priority content. And there is an obligation on providers to protect young people from this type of content. And it goes beyond. We haven't spoken much about algorithms yet, but there are expectations on tech providers to be able to provide an element of transparency and accountability, and work to make sure that young people are not being recommended content which is harmful. So I think there is a lot coming, and I think this year we'll see the beginning of the outputs. So I think what we have seen in the meantime, that the threat of regulation is quite powerful in itself, and we are seeing tech companies taking steps and making changes to their offering as they prepare for the oncoming regulation. So I think you can see that whatever is coming is going to have an impact, and I think we just need to wait and see and judge it on the outcomes. But having said that, if you think about the response to online harms more broadly, I can see regulation will have a really important part to play in terms of the platforms that young people are accessing. But there is a big part of education about making sure that young people know how to look after themselves and know how to look after others, and know what to do if something goes wrong whilst they're using technology, which is going to be there as important as ever it was before. So I don't see the Online Safety Act being the solution to the problem. I see it's going to be a good help. industry need to be held to account. And I think this does provide the regulator with teeth enough to be able to make change and difference within industry. But the education piece is still a big one that we mustn't lose sight of.
Thank you, Pat.
I have some concerns, I would say. I speak regularly to some of the families who've lost their sons, daughters to online harm. They've had to work extraordinarily hard to get this legislation through, to avoid amendments to the bill, to challenge Ofcom's interpretation and to keep pressure on this Act and its implementation. To me, as somebody who sits outside, it seems to be if everybody just wants to take their eye off the ball here, and it has taken an extraordinary amount of effort by a small number of people who've been directly affected to keep things focused. Sadly, I think that level of pressure has to be maintained because the dynamic around this seems to be that everybody just wants to carry on as normal, and a real pressure in terms of ensuring that the spirit of the Act and indeed the sanctions mentioned in the Act actually happen. And that the people are hauled over the coals, that sanctions are made, that examples are made, and that social media companies realise that they are being scrutinised and will be held to account. So I think, as Will points to, next year is probably a big year in terms of this Act. We would want to see this Act implemented, and where people have failed to comply, that those sanctions are placed very heavily on those people.
I would like to bring in Beth.
So, my question is targeted towards you, Patrick,
Yeah.
but Will, please feel free to come in afterwards. So, the Act covers new laws on illegal online behaviour. Do you have any comments on if young people have been well informed on these new laws and how it will affect them?
I think Will is probably better on this one, but I would say probably not. I think very few of us. The Online Act is a really complicated act. It's not an easy read, and I think there's very few people who could comfortably tell you exactly what's in that act. And I think, I would say young people are probably as perplexed as I am. But we'll probably give you a better answer, I'm sure.
Yeah, I won't solve the complexity of it, but I can say we did some research last October of 8 to 17-year-olds, and only 30% of young people had heard about it was a bill then, but it had been much in the news for about 18 months. So I think awareness of the legislation is very low, and I think we will need to be working to make sure that we raise people's awareness of it. I think that, but the Act is focused on systemic failure on industry's part. So they have systems in place. They have their own rules and terms and conditions that they provide for their own services. This is really an Act which is making sure that these service providers are implementing their own rules, really. And where they fail, that's when Ofcom will be there to make them accountable. So Ofcom is not there to make judgments about individual bits of content or disputes between users or abusive behaviour on the part of individuals. It's looking at a systemic level. And if you think of the scale of the service, you think, well, that's probably the way that a regulator will need to go. So I think it is important we raise people's education and awareness around this, and I think it's very low at the moment.
I will pass on to Zafira.
Patrick, from your expertise and experiences, how easy it is for young people to currently buy illegal weapons online?
Very. The answer, we haven't done any tests. Yeah, well, there has been some testing since the legislation came in on zombie knives. Your ability to go online, pick a online marketplace provider and probably have them delivered to your home address or a address with little age verification. Yeah, it's very easy. We've worked with some journalists who, since the zombie bill came in, were able to purchase zombie knives as well. So there is some concern. I know, on a positive note to this, that the Police and Home Office are doing an end-to-end review in terms of online sales, and that is, I believe, flagging up a number of key points. So I'm more optimistic than I have been about a solution being found to this and that loophole being closed. But presently, we see a huge, we believe there's a huge number out there, and I think if we look at the returns on the the surrenders of weapons, one retailer, I can't remember the number. I think it was they got a value about £350,000 worth of zombie knives, and that just shows you they would have been looking to shift those in about 6 months. It gives you an idea of the scale of this problem. So it's far too easy. That's why we've been campaigning for legislation, I think, and the end-to-end review will be a big help in terms of closing that loophole as well.
Thank you. Can I hand over to Sophie, please?
Thank you. I'll direct this question to Will, but Patrick, if there's anything to add, please do come in. The government is currently consulting on plans to make social media executives personally liable for failing to remove content that promotes knife crime. How confident are you in this approach?
I think we see that approach in other areas where people do take responsibility for, or companies do take responsibility in that way, and individuals can be held to account. I can see that would be quite a motivator. I don't want to speak out of turn, but we have seen, there's an app called Telegram, which has been quite permissive, to understate things in relation to its user protections and what it allows on its platform. And you can see that when the CEO was arrested in France a few months back, considerable changes have been made on that platform. Not enough changes, but you can. It's hard to say A cause B in this instance, but it's an indicator that can be a real motivator for people to do the right thing. So I think we'll just have to wait and see.
If I can follow up on that, the government have just closed a consultation on introducing sanctions against tech executives. In its current form, our response was that it doesn't go far enough. The sanctions that would be imposed on tech executives would be a fine, a civil action. If you're a high street retailer and you sell a knife to an under 18, which is illegal, you can not only be fined, but the current law, it's a summary offence. You could go to prison. We believe if you sell or are responsible, or provide a platform that's responsible for knives being sold online, the same penalties should apply. In the current process, how it would work would be the only people the police would flag to the social media companies the content that they believe should be taken down, and within 48 hours. There was nothing in the consultation which indicated how the public could contact the police and alert the police around this. The 48-hour that the content is allowed to stay online, we think is far too long. Content gets its most views generally when it's up early, so take it down quickly. Once the police have informed the tech company that they would like the content taken down, the tech company can appeal it, and it stays up while that appeal process is taking place. There's no indication of how long that should be. We believe as soon as it's flagged, it should be taken down, and the opposite should apply. We should have to argue to have it up, but it back up. So they're just some examples of where I think that the policy as outlined in the consultation document needs to be tightened up. and I think unless we make this a similar offence to selling a knife to a young person in high street, we're creating two different worlds, online and which is wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will hand over to Maximilian, please.
So in a sentence or two, if both of you, Patrick and Will, had to give advice to parents about how to help their children and young people navigate and understand the online world and social media, what would you tell them?
Talk to your young person, go and download the apps that they're on and understand how those apps work. Each generation tends to have its own little world in social media. Transgress and try and understand what's happening. And often when parents do, they're quite shocked at what the algorithms are throwing up in that content. It is about getting on a level playing field so you can have a real discussion about what's happening. And, don't be defensive. Learn and understand together. Yeah.
And Will?
I would say, I'll repeat much of what Patrick is saying. I think that the goal is to have conversations to make sure that that young people know that they can come and talk to you if they've got concerns or worries, but also use the opportunity to talk about things which you think that you need to. And I think there's enough going on in the media or elsewhere to try and find ways of talking about sometimes quite difficult subjects I'm not talking about you, let's talk about this topic, and using a media story as an example to talk about some things, about whether it be about influencers or pornography or other types of thing, to have that conversation and then be ready for not to overreact if your young person comes to tell you something which is shocking, because that we really want to make sure that we're supporting parents to support children, and so parents need to be there and be ready to get alongside young people and to help them through whatever the issue actually is. So we probably aim first for the conversational route. There are obviously tools there to help parents, and that's something that we do talk about with parents and carers, and sometimes that can be done in conjunction with children. This tech is very sticky, for example. It's quite helpful to have limits or downtimes or whatever for the young person as well as the parent and carer. So we'd probably focus most of all in that direction. And when we talk to young people, they actually want parents and carers to be involved in this way. And I think that's useful for parents to know.
Thank you. I believe Sienna has a question. If I could just ask you to be very, very brief with this one. Yeah.
So what do you think the role of Snapchat is in the sale and promotion of illegal weaponry?
That question for me? I think that I don't know about that, but certainly there are algorithms that's come under much scrutiny, and certainly from academia, I've seen, and Ofcom, some reports talking about how the drive towards user engagement has led users to more extreme content, and sometimes that content is violent. Presumably, that's also in relation to weapons. I don't know that, but violent content, extremist content, misogynist content. There are studies which do show that young users can be nudged in that direction by recommender systems, and that will fall under the auspices of the Online Safety Act. So if it's Snapchat that we're talking about or other services, that there is certainly something they're going to have to do to demonstrate that those recommender systems are not serving up harmful content to children and young people.
Thank you. And one final question for both of you. In one sentence, could you give me a summary of the most important piece of advice you would give to the government as to what they need to do to support young people and protect them from violent content online? I will start with Patrick.
The fear that young people have around knife crime is real, and that needs to be acknowledged. And we need to address that fear urgently.
Will?
I think to reiterate some of the things we've heard already, and knife crime is not my specialist area, but I think to have an authentic message, we need to really be listening to children and young people as we seek to work out what that message is. And I completely agree with the point not to have a message around fear, because that doesn't really drive behavior change in young people or anybody, actually. I think it's much more engaging, relevant messages where everybody can see the benefits and where it's come from and what it's trying to achieve.
Thank you so much. I believe that concludes our session. Thank you so much for joining us. You've made many meaningful contributions, and I believe it will impact our report very well. So thank you very much. Order, order.